Contour. Chapter 1. Route 41. Ivan Holt woke up before dawn, as he had for the past 15 years. He didn't need an alarm clock. His body, trained by years of military service, pulled him from sleep at the same minute every morning, regardless of the day of the week. The trailer was quiet. The air still held the chill of the night, but the dry desert heat was already tightening on his skin. Ivan pulled on a faded shirt, walked into the kitchen, and turned on the old coffee maker. The bitter aroma of coffee was part of his morning ritual. It didn't energize him, but it gave a sense of order. Everything beyond his control began later, when he left the boundaries of his land. The trailer stood on the outskirts, not of a town, but of civilization itself, beyond which stretched nothing but sand, hills, and abandoned power lines. The nearest store was far away, the meaning of hustle and bustle even further. But Ivan didn't seek closeness. He had chosen this plot for its silence and the absence of prying eyes. No one here asked who he had been before he ended up among wind-blasted cacti and flaking metal structures. No one questioned why an Air Force veteran, a former aircraft technician with high security clearance, was now a night guard at an auto parts warehouse. He headed to work before sunrise. The old pickup sputtered but started. Ivan drove along the deserted Route 41, narrow and cracked, stretching between gray hills. This road was one no longer used by public routes, unpatrolled and even forgotten by maps. Only occasional truckers or those purposefully avoiding federal highways dared to pass through. For Ivan, Route 41 had become a kind of border between the past he tried not to remember and the present he never quite got used to. Nothing happened at work. Surveillance cameras showed empty rows of boxes and containers, metal doors clicked shut. Ivan made his rounds, checked locks, turned lights on and off, listened to the silence broken only by the hum of transformers. It was a routine from which he expected neither meaning nor change. It simply existed, like the weathered walls of his trailer, like the sunburns on his arms, like the scars on his memory. After his shift, he didn't drive straight home. He decided to take a longer route and stop at an old gas station for coffee. But before he reached the turn, he noticed something ahead. Two dim taillights standing in the middle of the night's emptiness. He slowed down. As he approached, it became clear, a sedan with one side sagging. Next to the rear wheel, a figure, a woman crouched over a jack, a phone with a faint screen in her hand. Ivan's headlights caught her silhouette, short jacket, light hair, nervous movements, as if the whole world around her posed a threat. Ivan slowed the pickup to a stop and cracked the window. He didn't get out right away. It was late at night, a desert, an unfamiliar woman. But something in her posture, in her uncertain gestures, made him rise, take his flashlight, and approach her. She noticed him, stepped back a little, but didn't run. He realized she had no signal. There was rarely reception out here. He inspected the wheel, gestured that he'd help. She nodded. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was dense, filled with unspoken words. Ivan worked quickly. His hands moved automatically, as if he'd spent his whole life lifting cars in the dark. The woman stood a bit off, watching. Her gaze held no fear, only a strange mixture of anticipation and relief. When he finished, she stepped closer, said something, but he didn't catch it. The wind had risen, hissing through the dry bushes. He nodded, declined any payment, and returned to his truck. As he turned the key in the ignition, his headlights caught her face for a moment. She was looking straight at him, not like a random stranger, but as if she knew him. Not his face, not his name. Deeper, inside. That feeling followed him all the way home. He knew he'd seen her for the first time, and yet there was something familiar about her. Ivan arrived home by dawn. He didn't turn on the lights, just sat in his chair and stared into the darkness. The sky was beginning to brighten. In that silence, there was no peace. Something had cracked, shifted during the night, as if time, long frozen, had begun to move again. Route 41, which he had driven so many times, no longer felt like just a road. It had become the beginning of something greater, or perhaps a return to what he had tried to escape. Chapter 2. Tracks in the Dust. Morning in the desert came abruptly. The sun shot above the horizon like a blazing disk, instantly washing away the remnants of coolness. The air began to vibrate with heat even before 8 a.m. Ivan Holt woke up with a feeling that he had missed something important, though he had slept no longer than usual. Sleep hadn't brought him peace in years. It was more a brief pause than true rest. He got up, walked through the trailer, turned on the coffee maker, and opened the door. Outside, everything was as usual, just as empty, just as scorched. But something felt off. He didn't see it with his eyes. He sensed it through his skin. A slight shift in the familiar structure of the world. There were footprints in the sand leading to the front step. Not sharp, but distinct enough. Someone had come in the night. Someone who hadn't knocked, hadn't called, hadn't left a sign. Just stood there. Maybe watched. The prints weren't animal. The toes pointed directly at the door, as if the visitor had no doubt where they were going. Even examined them, then checked the door. The lock was secure as always, but the handle felt as though someone else had touched it. He crouched and ran a finger along the lower threshold. He used to scatter fine dust there out of habit, to spot mice or snakes. Now there was a smooth strip, as if someone had gently wiped it with a damp cloth. Ivan knew this wasn't paranoia. It was a sign. He went inside and turned off the coffee maker. He checked the kitchen, then the bedroom. Everything was in its place, but the uneasy sense of mismatch didn't go away. It was as if someone had nudged a chair, moved a book, left a drawer slightly ajar. Tiny details that might seem random, but Ivan knew chaos in the home of a solitary man obeys strict laws, and this was foreign. He went to the entryway and saw the envelope. It lay neatly on the windowsill, thick white paper, no markings, no return address. Inside, a folded sheet, no date, no name, just a short note. Thank you for the help. Some roads are not accidental. We will meet again. No signature, no hint of a joke. Ivan read the message several times, but not a word changed or disappeared. He sat on the edge of the bed holding the letter. His fingers squeezed it, as if the paper might yield a texture of truth. He remembered that night, the girl's face, her look, the strange confidence in her movements, as if she knew everything in advance. That her car would break down, that he would stop, even that he lived exactly here. He had never told her his address. He had barely said 24 words during their entire meeting, but she had called him by name. Ivan stood up and went to the closet. At the very bottom was a box, sealed, dusty, nearly forgotten. He opened it and took out old photos, his military tag, scraps of documents he hadn't turned in when he left the service. Among them, a faded map of the area with markings. He started matching them. The spot where he had found the girl was near one of the bases shut down years ago. The area was considered disused, but on satellite images he had once saved on an old laptop. He had noticed shadows, symmetrical, orderly, not natural. He spent the rest of the morning at the laptop, sorting through old files, map fragments, saved coordinates. Everything he found began to form a picture, disturbing in its plausibility. The girl hadn't just broken down on the road. She appeared like a marker, a clue, an embedded command activating a forgotten protocol. He opened a folder labeled Miscellaneous. Among old scans, he found a document he had once glimpsed, GHRMNY/interim circuit. Back in the 80s, he hadn't paid much attention to bureaucratic paperwork, but now that word, harmony, sent a shiver through him. It sounded too precise, as if someone had pulled it from a dream. Ivan stepped outside. The heat had become a wall. He walked the perimeter. No tire tracks, no footprints. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left him. He knew someone wasn't just observing. He was being tested. Someone wanted to make sure he still responded, still remembered, or was still vulnerable enough. That day he didn't go to town. He didn't call, didn't write. He sat at home, drank warm water, and tried to remember. Tried to find the point when his life had changed. Not outwardly, but inside, in the depth of consciousness. Maybe it hadn't happened when he left the service, or when he lost his family. Maybe he had never been there to begin with. Maybe he had been assembled from someone else's fragments. He went to bed late, but sleep never came. Somewhere outside, the wind rustled, and in the sand, Ivan again saw tracks. Incomplete, fading, as if someone had walked across a memory. Chapter 3, Double Echo. Ivan didn't go to town right away. For several days he stayed on his property, confining himself to a perimeter of a few hundred meters, as if afraid that stepping beyond it would shatter the fragile peace that could still be called a normal life. One question kept spinning in his mind. Why? Why had someone appeared in his life now? Why, after all these years of silence, had someone remembered him, or had never forgotten? He started sorting through old documents, carefully unfolding yellowed pages with notes. Most were unofficial copies, manuals, diagrams, scraps of protocols. They spoke of experimental methods of neurostimulation, the adaptation of consciousness to implanted memory, and fear modulation. But it all looked like old science, a forgotten era. What if the project had been shut down officially, but continued under a different name? On the third day, Ivan felt he could no longer sit still. He started the truck and drove to town, not so much for groceries as for confirmation that he was still alive. Real, not a vanishing man, someone who could see others and be seen. He parked by the 24-hour diner, the only place around where the old coffee maker still worked and one could remain unnoticed. He entered, ordered breakfast, and sat in a corner. The space around him seemed as always quiet, the sizzle of a skillet in the kitchen, drops of grease on the grill, a radio murmuring the news. Everything looked normal as life could be in places where it had long been reduced to routine cycles. That's when he saw her. She was sitting by the window, her back to the room. Light fell on her hair, and Ivan immediately knew. It was her, the same girl from the roadside, Sarah, without a jacket, in a simple shirt, a notebook in her hands. She was writing something, occasionally glancing up and pretending to look outside. But once her eyes flicked to the mirror and locked with his. She didn't look surprised. She didn't flinch. She just nodded, like someone who had long known this meeting would happen. Ivan didn't approach right away. He finished his breakfast, paid, got up, took a step toward the exit, then turned back and sat down across from her. They remained silent for a long time. There was no fear in her eyes, and in his, no more doubt. She pulled a small sheet from her notebook and placed it on the table. It was an old photograph, a group of people in military uniforms, but without insignia. Ivan stared at the photo, feeling something inside him tremble. He saw that face, his own, younger, tense, with eyes full of resolve. But he didn't remember the picture ever being taken. Sarah spoke a few words. No explanations, no theatrics, just the core. She knew who he was, and she knew he was one of those who had once been rebooted. The project he had participated in hadn't died. It had merely changed coordinates and curators. She was connected to it, once through her father, now on her own. She wasn't an agent, not a spy, not an enemy, but not a friend either. She was a link, a transmitter. Ivan listened silently. He felt that the person before him hadn't come for forgiveness or to issue a threat. She was searching for what was left of who he had once been, or was supposed to be. Her voice held uncertainty, like someone who wasn't sure if they were doing the right thing. She said she was looking for evidence. That Project Harmony had been relaunched, now under the guise of neuropsychological therapy. It no longer hid in bunkers. It operated through labs, grants, private clinics, and military research contracts. She admitted Ivan wasn't the first person she had approached, but he was the first who remembered. The others either broke or disappeared. She believed there was still a link in him, between the past and what could still be saved. That his memory, no matter how altered, still contained critical fragments, perhaps the key ones. She was trying to understand why his memory had survived better than the rest. Maybe because he had left the project before completion. Ivan didn't reply. He just took the photo, looked at it again, and put it in his pocket. He stood up, glanced at Sarah, and walked out. The heat outside was oppressive, but he felt cold. Her words echoed, not because they were important, but because they reminded him of something he had heard before, or was meant to hear. A double echo, between memory and oblivion. When he returned home, the door was ajar. On the table lay another envelope, unsigned. Inside, coordinates and a note. You are still active. Your reaction has been confirmed. The next phase will begin in 48 hours. Ivan sat in his chair, closed his eyes, and understood. There was no turning back. Everything he had done was merely delay. He hadn't just been found, he had been activated. And now the road led not into the desert, but back to the heart of what he thought had been destroyed. Chapter 4, The Curator. Ivan drove north along the ridge beyond which began a restricted zone, territory once belonging to a military research program, now marked on maps as empty. With each mile, the road became more uncertain. First the signs disappeared, then the asphalt cracked, and finally the road itself ended. What remained was scorched land, stones, dry bushes, and silence broken only by the hum of the wind. He checked coordinates against a paper map and followed instinct, as if an inner compass was guiding him back to where it all began. Around noon, he stopped at the base of a low bluff that, according to his calculations, should overlook the old complex. The landscape seemed dead, but there was tension in the air, barely perceptible, like the feeling before a storm. Ivan killed the engine and continued on foot, leaving the truck behind the bend. After 30 minutes of climbing, he reached a flat plateau. There, among the rocks and dust, stood a concrete structure, almost merged with the landscape. No signs, no guards, with peeling doors and boarded-up windows. But Ivan sensed it wasn't abandoned. It was asleep. He approached. The door was ajar as if he was expected. Inside it was cool. The light didn't come from lamps but from hidden sources. Dim, even, almost sterile. He walked down a narrow corridor, the walls stained with old paint, leaks, and peeling enamel. But here and there, modern panels were built in. New, glossy, not of this era. He passed them without stopping, knowing his path was straight, without forks. He was being led. At the end of the corridor was an automatic door that opened silently. Behind it, a room like an operating theater, but without equipment. Just a glass partition and a figure behind it. A woman in white, her hair pulled into a tight bun. Her face hadn't changed, except for deeper wrinkles and a quieter gaze. Ivan recognized her immediately. Dr. Verne, the curator. The one who had guided him during the project. The one whose instructions he once followed, whose voice spoke through the simulation room speakers, whose signature appeared on documents no one ever read to the end. She stepped from behind the glass like an actor entering a stage. There was no surprise or fear in her movements, only measured calm. Ivan stood still, letting silence fill the room. In that silence, the past echoed. She came closer, and there was no distance left between them. Only memories, the ones he believed were his, and the ones that might have been implanted. Dr. Verne spoke with confidence, without excuses. She admitted that Project Harmony was never frozen. It had merely changed its name, its form, and its goals. It had passed into the hands of private contractors, adapted into a medical model. Now they work for those who could pay. Governments, corporations, even private institutes. Ivan had been one of the first carriers, and his profile was considered stable. His memory, flexible. His response to implanted fragments, controllable. He was valuable. He was unique. She explained that those who went through the early phases of the program now lived across the country. Some had lost their memories. Others had withdrawn into themselves. Only a few retained stability. Those like Ivan weren't just monitored. They were controlled. Signals were sent to them. Markers. The encounter with Sarah hadn't been accidental. It was a test, and he passed. His reaction confirmed that the residual memory was active. The circuit wasn't broken. Ivan listened without interrupting. He didn't ask questions. The answers didn't need words. He felt that everything he had experienced in recent weeks was a continuation of a long experiment. His life wasn't just the result of choices, but of architecture built by someone else. His withdrawal, his resignation, his family's loss, they could all be part of the chain, or simply side effects of interference. Dr. Verne offered him a return, not literally, not to the system, but to the context, to accept his role, to acknowledge that he was a memory carrier, capable of activating a circuit that held key fragments. She didn't threaten, didn't persuade. She stated. To her, it was logical, rational, necessary. Harmony, she claimed, wasn't a tool of power, but a way to remove suffering. By erasing pain, they restored functionality. By implanting others' experiences, they accelerated adaptation. Was it ethical? She didn't answer. She just looked at him, as if trying to find the answer in his face. He didn't answer her. He turned and walked away. With every step down the corridor, his movements grew more rigid, as if he was fighting gravity. Inside, everything boiled. Not from anger, but from realization. His past, possibly fabricated. His feelings, possibly not his. But what he felt now, real anger, fear, disgust, this was genuine. He stepped out of the building, squinting at the sunlight, inhaling the dry, heavy desert air. They hadn't broken him. He had been activated, yes, but not in the way they wanted. They thought they were reclaiming a tool, but they had reawakened a memory, his own. Chapter 5, Circuit Break. Ivan Holt returned home late, when the sunset had already burned out beyond the horizon, leaving rusty blue streaks in the sky. His trailer greeted him as always, with creaking steps, heavy air, and the faint smell of metal and dust. Inside it was quiet, but it wasn't the silence he used to know. Not a peaceful emptiness, but a dull echo of something approaching. He closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it for a moment, feeling an alien rhythm thudding in his chest. There was no doubt, after the meeting with Dr. Verne, there was no going back. Something had changed not only in his understanding of the situation, but in the very fabric of reality. The world, which had seemed distant and detached, was now collapsing around him like an old map folding into a point. Every object in the house began to feel unfamiliar. Every corner, as if already inspected by someone else. Nothing felt right. Ivan went to the bedroom and pulled out an old bag from under the bed. Inside was a revolver he hadn't touched in over 10 years. He checked the barrel, made sure it hadn't rusted, disabled the safety, and reloaded. He wasn't planning a war. He just didn't want to be unarmed again. Like back then, in the room with the fake windows and a voice from a speaker telling him who he was. He sat at the table, turned on the laptop and inserted a flash drive. One of the ones Sarah had given him, with data on the project's structure, names of former participants, and a list of institutions where sessions of neuroadaptation were still being held. Some addresses were already closed, others were active as private clinics. But that wasn't the most important part. The main thing was a folder he hadn't yet opened, marked with his name. Ivan Holt, dossier, full archive. He opened it. Inside, medical reports, protocol scans, neuroimaging results, analyses, all about him, his reactions to stimuli, psycho-emotional load charts, results of memory implantation. He was reading about himself as if he were a lab mouse. Dry lines devoid of emotion. Subject H47 demonstrates stable integration of implanted biographical elements. Memory of real events replaced with simulated trauma in 82% of cases. Empathic response to control stimulus suppressed. He read and didn't recognize his life. Many events he had thought real were marked in the documents as interpolated. The death of a comrade during service, a simulation, the night shift after which he filed for resignation, an implanted scenario. Even the morning conversation with his commander, where the man supposedly admitted Ivan was right, recorded as an experiment in a replay chamber. Everything he had held on to as the core of his identity turned out to be part of a design scheme. Constructed, tuned, assigned. He leaned back in his chair. His throat tightened. His breathing became ragged. This wasn't just anger. It was collapse. Of identity, time, history. He realized he wasn't a person anymore, but a set of reactions assembled into a single body for the sake of an experiment. And yet, in this realization, something paradoxical emerged. He felt real pain, which meant, despite everything, he was still himself. Late at night, he opened the map again, entered the coordinates from the last envelope, the site marked in the file as active node. It was a small facility in the mountains where, according to the data, the project's backup system was stored, a server containing archives of implanted identities. If he destroyed it, not just shut it down but physically erased it, the circuit would break. Ivan knew this wouldn't stop everything, but it might deprive the system of its center of gravity, take it out of play, like knocking over one piece in a line of dominoes. He packed quickly, took a backpack, food, weapon, map. Before leaving, he left a note on the table, a short letter. Not a will, not a confession, just words. If I'm a lie, let my actions be real. The road to the mountains took nearly a day. He avoided highways, turned onto old back roads, traveled at night. He wasn't sure if he was being followed, but acted as if surveillance was behind every bend. Eventually, the road ended. He continued on foot, climbing in the cold stillness, through crunching stones and thorny bushes. The facility was smaller than expected. A concrete box among the rocks, no visible security. Everything was automated. He got inside through a rear panel. He knew where to look, remembered the layouts. Right under the central console was the node, a cylindrical server with sealed memory. He attached a charge wired to a timer, stepped outside, walked 100 meters, and sat down to wait. When the explosion came, he didn't watch. He just closed his eyes. And in that darkness, for the first time in years, he heard nothing. No foreign voices, no commands, no memories that weren't his. For the first time, he felt silence. Real silence. He knew a reverse wave would begin soon. The system would sense the breach. Someone would come looking. Someone would try to reassert control. But he was already beyond it. Ivan Holt, subject H-47, was off the leash. He had only one thing left to do. Disappear. Not hide. Not run. Disappear as if he had never existed. Or as if he had finally become himself. Chapter 6, Nameless. Ivan Holt knew he was not who he thought he was, not because he had been deceived, but because his entire life had been a test. And even what he considered an awakening was part of the experiment. He thought he had been running from the past, but that past was stitched from fragments, other people's memories, false pieces, simulations conducted in the years when he himself was designing the harmony protocols. He thought he had built the system to heal, to help others deal with trauma. But then someone asked, what if we implant memory into the architect himself? And they chose him. He hadn't forgotten it of his own will. His mind had been rewritten, not as a subject, but as a key case. Can a personality be built out of someone else's guilt? The answer was before him, his entire life. And now that he remembered, he no longer knew who he was. He found Sarah not by coordinates, but by a hint in her letter. A ramshackle house in the desert, the roof sagging under the sun. She sat by the window smoking, staring into emptiness. When she saw him, she didn't act surprised. She simply closed her eyes. I thought you wouldn't come, she said softly. Me too, he replied. She was silent. So was he. There was too much truth between them to begin with explanations again. They gave me a recording, she said finally, about you, about everything. They said if I passed it on, I'd get information on Ethan. I passed it. You knew I was a lie. I hoped there was still a drop of truth in you. He looked at her. Her hands were shaking. What do you want now? Sarah thought for a long time. Then with difficulty she said, I don't know. I have no goal, only remnants. But if even one more person can remember who they are, maybe that's better than nothing. Dr. Verne wasn't hiding. She met Ivan at her home, an ordinary apartment that smelled of coffee, books, and loneliness. She wasn't wearing a lab coat, didn't turn on any equipment, just put the kettle on. You came to accuse me? She asked. He shook his head. I came to understand. She sat across from him. I didn't erase you. I preserved you. Inside you was so much pain, it could have destroyed not just you, but everyone around. I just cut off what you couldn't carry anymore. You created a lie. I created a chance for a new personality. You became better, Ivan, calmer. You even started to believe in good. Is that bad? He was silent for a long time. Then he said, It wasn't true. And that was the point. Months passed. He no longer sent data, didn't search for responses, didn't build a network. He didn't believe in a mass awakening. Too many foreign fragments were buried too deep in those who had been rewritten. He just lived in a small cabin, Sometimes people came to him. They didn't ask for help. They simply talked, searching for meaning. One day a man arrived, quiet, tired. He brought a photograph, old, faded. They told me you might explain something, he said. Even took the picture. He recognized the place, and the building, and even the light, but not the faces. I don't remember them, but every time I look, something inside trembles. He nodded. Do you want to remember? The man nodded. I'm not sure I'll like it, but yes. Ivan silently handed him another photo, a child, with a crooked cap, laughing. The man stared at it for a long time, then whispered, My name was Thomas. He didn't know where it came from, but it was there, and it was his. Ivan didn't save humanity, didn't destroy the system, didn't restore memories to millions. He just helped one man get back one name. And in that moment, it was enough. No triumph, no final scene, but the truth.